Is the Iran nuclear deal dead? A year after the US abandoned the agreement, Tehran suspends parts of it and gives those countries which signed up to it an ultimatum to meet their commitments, including protection from US sanctions. Can the deal be renegotiated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Donald Trump called it the worst deal ever. The US president decided a year ago to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement, which imposed limits on Tehran's nuclear activities. Trump then reimposed sanctions against Iran and recently extended them to threaten those countries still party to the deal. Iran's now reacted, warning the UK, France, Germany, China and Russia it'll step up uranium production unless they meet their commitments within 60 days. Britain says the decision is an unwelcome step, while France says more sanctions could be reimposed. Zain Basravi has more from Tehran.
Exactly 1 year after the United States pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal, Iran says it will suspend cooperation with some of the commitments under the agreement. President Hassan Rouhani let world powers know his country will not abide by stockpile limits on enriched uranium and heavy water. But he said it was a reciprocal move after the United States introduced new sanctions earlier this week, designed to target the framework of the nuclear deal itself. Iranian experts say that the latest U.S. sanctions effectively forced Iran to take some sort of action.
Iranians and all people around the world should know that today is not the end of the nuclear deal. Today is a new step for the JCPOA and is within the framework of the JCPOA. The deal has given us this right, that if the other party violates its commitments, we can raise it in the Joint Commission in a scheduled time, and that timing was passed. We had meetings at the level of deputy ministers and foreign ministers. Europeans and our friends several times emphasized that they would compensate it somehow, but practically they didn't meet their commitments.
Iranian leaders maintain that limiting their level of cooperation with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is still in keeping with the wording of the deal. If in the next 2 months remaining signatories to the deal can do something to help mitigate the economic pressure on Iran from U.S. oil and banking sanctions, Rouhani said his country would gladly return to abiding by its side of the bargain. But as tensions escalate between Tehran and Washington, President Hassan Rouhani's latest comments put more pressure on his own partners, the remaining signatories to the nuclear deal, to do something to salvage an agreement that's been in jeopardy since U.S. President Donald Trump took office. Zain Basravi for Inside Story.
We'll get to our discussion in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at some key developments since the US withdrawal. In January, Iran's European allies began looking for alternative channels to keep trade going despite US sanctions. But the Trump administration continued putting pressure on Tehran. Last month, the US imposed stricter sanctions on Iranian oil exports and put Iran's Revolutionary Guard on a list of terrorist organizations. And recently, the American aircraft carrier group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, was deployed to the Strait of Hormuz. 17 million barrels of oil are taken through this sea route in the Gulf every day. Iran has threatened to close it multiple times. Let's bring in our guests in Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, Professor of North American Studies at the University of Tehran. On Skype from Reston, Virginia, Rina Shah, Republican strategist and consultant. And in Berlin, Ali Fathollah-Nejad, visiting fellow at Brookings Doha Center. A welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with you, Mohammad Marandi, in Tehran. This has been a very aggressive policy by this administration, this US administration, to Iran. We're always expecting Iran to react. In your opinion, is this a fair reaction, the events of the day?
I think it's a rather mild reaction, but President Rouhani has said that there will be further acts on behalf of Iran if the European Union does not change its policy. The Iranians have shown strategic patience for the last year, at least, actually far more than that in my opinion. When the Americans exited the agreement, the Europeans promised that they would abide by their commitments, and Iran has for a year now, been waiting for the Europeans to do something, and they've done nothing. They've said all the nice things that need to be said, but words are not enough. And so far, the Europeans have not linked Iran to the global financial sector, which is what they have promised, and they have not purchased any Iranian oil, which is also part of their commitment. And then there are other things that they should be doing, and they haven't. So the Iranians are giving the Europeans 60 days to decide whether they're going to abide by the commandments of Trump, or are they going to protect their citizens, their businesses, their banks, and abide by their commitments.
But Mohammad, we talk about this 60-day deal, but the reaction almost immediately from, let's say, France and from Britain. Britain said it was an unwelcome step, and then France said, well, more sanctions may be expected. I don't know if that's encouraging for Iran. I don't know whether the Europeans are going to play ball.
Well, the Iranians don't have any expectations. It is rather extraordinary that the French and the British, who have not been abiding by their commitments whatsoever, that they have made all sorts of promises but have not delivered on any of them at all. For them to say that this is unwelcome or to threaten Iran, I think that only angers ordinary Iranians, but it's expected by Iranian policymakers. The Iranians really have no option. The Americans are trying to strangle the Iranian people, and the Iranians see how the American government is trying to brutalize ordinary people in Venezuela, how the Americans are helping the Saudis starve the people in Yemen, how the Americans destroyed Libya, what they've done to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And the Iranians know quite well that appeasing the regime in Washington is not going to get the country anywhere. So I think what the Rouhani administration has done is that he's shown the international community that it is Iran that is abiding by its commitments, that it is Iran that is trying to ease tensions, and that it is the United States that is pushing for escalation, along with its friends in the region like Netanyahu, NBS, and the Mohammed bin Zayed. And I think that itself is a big plus. And so from here on, I think many or most, if not all, fair-minded people in the international community will recognize that Iran has every right to push back.
Rina Shah, in Reston, Virginia, Iran has every right to push back. Now, there doesn't seem to be a unified policy from this administration toward Iran. On the one hand, you have the US President Donald Trump, who says Rouhani is a good man. He would like them to come back to the negotiating table. Then you have Mike Pompeo, who seems to take a more middle ground, suggesting that all actions, all options are on the table. And then you have John Bolton, who is sending the US Lincoln Carrier Group to the Strait of Hormuz. So it doesn't seem to be unified, but much more than that. Is there a unified strategy here? Or is the Republican Party really just making up as it goes along?
I think that's an interesting assessment there of the making it up as you go along, because it does seem that this administration tends to do that in many ways. And now in foreign policy, in which we've been unified for a very long time, whether you look at whichever party's in power, the United States likes to show a very composed, organized, deliberate front when confronting regimes like the one in Iran. So this is unusual, but I have to say, as you've heard me talk about on your program before here, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of this president's strategy, his approach, the way in which he speaks about certain leaders in the world who I don't find to be leaders. However, I think we would have been best served by Donald Trump continuing to go about it in a way in which he wanted. However, when he decided to surround himself with war hawks, people like John Bolton, there was no other strategy in John Bolton's mind. He wants war. And I think it's a very scary proposition at this moment in time, where we have so many things we're juggling on the world stage, to think of this as another issue that could blow up. Really, right now it's in a point where I think this relationship is certainly strained. The reaction from Iran, I'm not surprised, but I don't know how the Trump administration really moves forward without letting Pompeo and Bolton take the front seat, and that's what President Trump has decided to do. He has listened to them. They have said this Iran deal was non-functional and it's been flawed from the get-go. It's a remnant of Obama's era. And as many people know in the international community, President Trump doesn't like anything that that President Obama left behind. So let's see where we go from here. This is a moment. It's a pivotal moment, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty ahead, no doubt.
Ali Fathollah-Nejad in Berlin. We are at a pivotal moment. There is a carrier group steaming toward the Strait of Hormuz as we speak. Europe has been given notice of 60 days to come to their commitments that they agreed before. Do you think Europe is going to be the peace broker here, or do you think Europe is going to have to choose a side?
Well, things are getting more complicated for the Europeans, obviously, and now with this kind of Iranian deadline. And it is hard to see how the Europeans would be able to transform the special purpose vehicle Instex into something that the Iranian side would economically benefit from and be happy with. So the fact remains that we have the dominance of the US sanctions regime globally on the banking and financial sectors, and this is not going to change. There's a strong compliance regime when it comes to US sanctions, so it's really hard to see how the Europeans could encourage their companies to engage in trade with Iran, something that they have been reluctant to do so up until now. As we see from different reactions in Europe, Europe, of course, remains committed to the nuclear deal. It doesn't want to see it unravel. And on the other hand, there is obviously more skepticism in Paris, talking about the potential reimposition of sanctions on Iran, while in Berlin we've heard from the foreign ministry that while they remain committed to the nuclear deal, they also warn Iran against aggressive steps. This might be something, a kind of an escalation in the Persian Gulf region or in the wider West Asian theater, where you might see some kind of confrontation between Iranian allied forces and US allied forces.
Mohammad Marandi in
for
Tehran,
now, I think
Rina Shah hinted at this. She said that this president doesn't like anything that President Obama did. Maybe the quickest way out of this is simply to go back to the renegotiating table, negotiate a treaty which is almost exactly the same as the one you have already, and be done with it.
That's impossible, because if the Iranians begin to appease the regime in Washington, then this will be the first step of many. The Americans will conclude that every time you bully another country, every time you strangle ordinary people, every time you make ordinary people suffer, every time you impose hunger like they do in Yemen, then you get results. And that is a very dangerous move, and it would push Iran in a very dangerous direction. The Iranians have already made significant concessions. In fact, the nuclear deal was controversial, as you know, from the very start. Many people in Iran were opposed to it from day one, and they said it wouldn't work. But the Iranians negotiated for over a decade. They gave significant concessions. They were flexible, and ultimately they signed the nuclear deal, and they ended certain parts of the nuclear program, and they toned down other parts, even though there was never any real evidence to show that Iran's nuclear program was anything but peaceful. But Iran wanted to bring stability to the region, to show the international community that despite the narrative from Washington that Iran wasn't the troublemaker. And now, after giving those concessions, this is how the United States behaves, and worse than, and I think even what's even more ugly is how the Europeans are behaving. Because on the one hand, they expect Iran to commit itself to the nuclear deal, yet they are not committing themselves at all to what they promised to do. And I think that this creates a more dangerous situation, because Iran will have to begin to push back. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates should expect the road ahead to get more bumpy. There is serious talk in Iran of beginning stop-and searches against towards Saudi and Emirati ships coming from and to Saudi and Emirati ports, whether they're cargo or oil. They are pushing the region towards a very dangerous situation. The Iranians believe that the U.S. president doesn't want war, and neither does the CIA or the military, because they know that if there is a war in the region, everything in the Persian Gulf will be destroyed. The shutting of the Strait of Hormuz would be a sideshow. All the oil facilities, the tankers in the Gulf of Oman and in the Persian Gulf, they'll be destroyed. That's how war will end, and it will lead to a global economic catastrophe. And Trump knows that. So whether the military and those who are more sane in Washington can push back against Bolton and Pompeo, that's an open question. But the Europeans, besides their commitments, they should also be putting pressure on Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Otherwise, I think people in these two countries should start pulling out their money from these two regimes.
Rina, it's clear that the Europeans are now key players once again in this. The gauntlet has been thrown down, the ball's in their court. You can use all the cliches that you want, but it's down to the Europeans in this 60-day deadline. Now, what is America thinking when it comes to the Europeans? Do they think that they've got allies there, that they will eventually side with America? What are the Republicans thinking?
Republicans think that when America leads, Europe will follow. And I think that's sort of wrong in this moment. My conventional wisdom tells me that things have really changed, and some in my party are unwilling to accept that. So I think it's time for something new. I don't know what that something new means. I think that we've gone too far down the road to have President Trump sort of pull back and say, let's come back to the table and renegotiate something that has my name on it. I think that's his first preference, but we're too far gone from that. But again, about your guest in Tehran, I disagree with some points, but the larger picture is true. This is about America's relationship with Saudi Arabia in this very moment. And as many know, that the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has been tasked with creating peace in the Middle East, and he's been wildly unsuccessful at it, if you ask me. So when you have the naivety that sort of prevails in this administration, what you're going to find over and over is a lack of unity, as we talked about earlier, and a lack of an approach that is going to be thoughtful and going to be fair, rather, to our allies. And in this very moment, our allies that we used to have are really no longer our allies. So everything is very, very fractured on the world stage at this moment, and certainly these cliques that are prevailing in this moment are not helping the many people that are suffering. But I take great issue with the United States constantly being blamed for all of it. I mean, there are bad leaders in these countries, and Iran being one of them, that have caused their people to suffer for a very long time. This is elementary what I'm talking about. I mean, this is the Iranian people have not suffered entirely because of America's decisions. And so to continue forward and say that everything that happens from this moment forward, that America is continuing to make the Iranian people suffer, I think is a bit disingenuous.
I mean, you are sending a carrier group to the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian people are going to feel uncomfortable about that.
Correct, but they had a lot of options as well to come to the table in a very different way, and I think.
But they did come to the table.
Sort of I think
they did negotiate,
waited a while,
and they negotiated in good faith. Let me bring in Ali Fathollah-Nejad in here. There was an agreement. It was negotiated in good faith. I mean, Europe must be looking at this and thinking to themselves, how have we got here?
Well, absolutely. There was an agreement. And obviously, the U.S. administration, with its withdrawal last year, violated the agreement. And because of the predominance of the U.S. In the financial and banking sectors, as I said earlier, it's very difficult for Europe to provide for the economic benefits. But I think what is happening right now is also what the Europeans understand, is that what Iran is trying to do is to reestablish the leverage they had vis-à-vis the West, but also the United States, by trying to, to re-energize the nuclear program to an extent where they would be able to reach a nuclear threshold at some point in time. So by reestablishing its leverage, that a decade ago was the precondition for getting U.S. concessions. Back then it was the U.S. dropping the zero enrichment demand on Iran. So this is what the Iranians are trying to do, to regain leverage for any future kind of engagement or negotiation with the United States. as we've seen for Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif's recent visit to the United States, was trying to actually appeal to the US President Trump and to potentially open channels of communication, because the Islam Republic knows that because of its acute economic crisis at home, it has to look for a solution when it comes to sanctions with the United States. On the other hand, despite this Iranian overture vis-a-vis President Trump, there is still some controversy in Iran. There are some hardline elements who argue that Iran cannot now enter into negotiations with the United States because it is in a position of weakness. In order to remedy this, Iran is now going into phases of a potential gradual retreat from the JCPOA that would reestablish its leverage for any future negotiations with the United States.
Mohammad and Marandi, what do you think of that? Iran is actually negotiating by stealth. It's getting back to what it was doing a decade ago, thinking it can parlay this into a new deal. Is that what's happening, do you think?
No, I actually spoke with Dr. Zarif yesterday. He is very much against negotiations with the United States. The United States has to go back to the nuclear deal in order to begin negotiations with Iran, as they were negotiating. The Iranians and the Americans, alongside the other members of the P5+1, they were all negotiating for years. And even at the beginning of the Trump presidency, Tillerson was at the table. It was the United States that left. So the only way forward, really, for Iran is to show that the United States that they cannot bully the country. And Iran does not accept the claim that the Europeans don't have leverage. The Europeans, if they don't have leverage, if they can't protect their citizens, if they can't protect their businesses and their dignity, then they have no right to be sitting at any negotiating table. And I think other countries across the world should take note of that. If the Europeans, on the other hand, want to be respected and to be taken seriously, then they have to use that leverage. Their economy is larger than that of the United States, and they have the opportunity to cooperate with countries like Russia and China to make sure that they abide by the nuclear deal. It's not a one-sided relationship between the United States and Europe. So from the Iranian perspective, that excuse is completely unacceptable. But what I think is going to happen is that, yes, Iran will continue to use its strengths, and Iran is strong. Iran's allies in Iraq are strong, in Afghanistan and across the region. And the Americans know that. If there is any confrontation, and remember, that's not what Iran wants. That's why Iran signed the nuclear deal.
Sadly, we are running out of time, and I do want to get to the other guests as well. Mohammad, you make a very, very good point. Rina, I want to bring you in here. Iran isn't Iraq in 2003. It's not Afghanistan in 2001. This is a country that is militarily strong and has friends in the region.
Well, don't forget that there are a number of people in Washington today who believe that the former points you made are true. They do see Iran to be something of a relic of the past, and they're trying to deal with it as such. Like I said, the mentality of the neoconservatives and the establishment here still prevails, despite the current president's desires to really do things differently. So when that mentality is what sort of rules the day, you're not going to convince these people otherwise. There's the idea that American military strength and a power move like sending the tanker we have, that this is what's going to work. And again, there's no creativity here. So what I think is we are headed down a really bad road, no doubt. But I know that this is a prevailing mentality, and there's no way to change it right now.
Well, we have 60 days. The deadline is in place and Europe has to react. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this subject again. I want to thank all our guests, Mohammad, Marandi, Rina, Shah and Ali Fathollah-Nejad. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.